How are working parents doing in 2022? Since the start of the pandemic, we've heard about the challenges working parents have faced struggling to balance a full-time job with the responsibilities of taking care of a dependent child. This is why Charlotte Works partnered with Goodwill in releasing the Working Parent Survey to better understand their needs and how we could support their return to the labor force. And so today, there are three main things I want to focus on. The state of working parents exiting the labor force as a lead up to this survey, the results of our working parent survey, what did working parents say, what was their voice in terms of what they needed and the support they needed in order to be successful, and then lastly, what are some best practices for employers that are interested in attracting and retaining working parent talent. And again, starting off with what we were saying about working parents exiting the labor force. This was the lead up to the survey. This was one of the key motivators for us to partner with Goodwill, is that in 2020, we saw a disproportionate number of working mothers exit the labor force. So here you can see on this graph the percent of mothers with school-aged children who left the labor force for different months in 2020. And you can see that high concentration, particularly for those exiting the labor force coming from the service industry. Again, an industry that is predominantly female, that has a large number of in-person job requirements, and it's got a large number of mothers that exited the labor force because of those issues. And despite even the pandemic subsiding since 2020, even into 2021, one of the issues we saw is that working mothers were not returning to the labor force at the same rate as their counterparts. And so here in this graph, you can see that even into 2021, working mothers, despite leaving, were not returning to the workforce at the same rate as their counterparts, and especially their non-parent counterparts. And so we wanted to look at this in more detail to say, what can we do to better support working parents in their return to the workforce in order to enable them to be successful? And so our survey with Goodwill, we had three key goals here. We wanted to better understand the motivating factors behind working parents not returning. We wanted to assess their needs and determine how to best support working parents from an employer standpoint and from a workforce partner standpoint. And lastly, we wanted to explore the impact on specific industries and occupations of working parents, specifically highlighting that disproportionate number of exits we saw from the service industry. How had the pandemic changed their attitudes and preferences based on industry and occupation? And so the findings from our working parent survey result, I want to share with you the key takeaways from our survey now, starting with the demographics. So you can see from our survey, we had over 200 responses. 81% of our respondents were female, 73% of our respondents were Black, 73% had 2 or more dependents, 61% had an associate's degree or higher, and 61% were 44 or younger. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the breakdown of our working parent responses by zip code throughout the Charlotte region, and you see a particularly high concentration in that north and west part of Mecklenburg County. So let's get into the takeaway. What did working parents say? What do they need in order to be returning to the workforce and in order to be successful in their return to the workforce? And so the most important factors for working parents in terms of their job search and in terms of staying at their current job, the most important factors to them were having a company that supported their health and well-being, their own mental health, as well as the well-being and growth of their children. The hours at work, having flexibility, not having too much overtime, being able to attend to the balancing that's needed between working full-time and taking care of a dependent. And then having a company culture that really understood and supported their needs. So a supportive company culture. And then below that, still important though, you see the rate of pay, or they're seeking better compensation. And so again, this is something to focus on, as while that rate of pay is still critically important for any occupation, you can see even above rate of pay right now, there are other things that individuals are prioritizing in the workforce in order to find that balance. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the average hourly rate of pay for that minimum requirement for people to return to the workforce was $33 an hour. And so you might look at that and say that's a particularly high number. However, considering the demographics of our survey, I think it's important context. So First of all, we know over 60% of our respondents had an associate's degree or higher, and so that median earnings in the Charlotte area is right around $60,000 a year for the individuals with that education level. And then again, we know that over 70% of our respondents had 2 or more dependents, and we know that in order to earn a living wage in Mecklenburg County for a family of 3 or 4, that number is also closer to that number that we see on the right-hand side of the screen. So again, not something that's overly surprising given the demographics of our survey. And so really, in terms of retaining working parents, there were 2 things that really stood out as surprising takeaways from this survey. The first is that 94% of caretakers would consider switching industries for a remote position. And so we talked about this at the start of this presentation with the large number of working mothers exiting the service industry, understanding that a large number of those occupations have in-person requirements. So the focus is not so much on a specific industry right now, but working parents are really looking for those remote work opportunities in order to balance the needs of a full-time job and taking care of a child. The second most surprising takeaway here to that point is that 86% of caretakers were actively seeking or open to new employment. So again, to that point of considering switching industries, a number of individuals were either actively seeking those types of positions or open to new employment in order to find a position that was a better fit for them to balance full-time work with their dependent responsibilities. And so this is something where employers that have working parents on their team may want to look at the results of the survey and say, even if you don't have an issue attracting this type of talent, if you're not being responsive to these results, you may have an issue retaining working parents. And so how do you attract and retain working parents? Well, there were 3 key takeaways from our survey. Caretakers need working arrangements with flexibility. We talked about this. If you've got school pickup or drop off in the late afternoon, being able to work earlier or work later to accommodate that. Having the remote work environment where you can juggle multiple things, dealing with your children and working full-time. Caretakers placing a high value on health and well-being, not only their own mental health, but supporting the growth and development of their children in these critical development windows. And lastly, caretakers want a supportive company culture, a company that is going to be there and understand their needs and be responsive to this balancing act that they have to deal with. And so the other key takeaway we had from this survey was 89% of our non-parent respondents, those respondents without dependents, supported employers offering flexible work or care options to those with dependents. So it's important to remember that some of these policies aren't going to be divisive in the workplace. These are policies that are universally supported by parents and non-parents alike. And so when we get into what does this mean? So in terms of what can an employer do in order to be responsive to this survey, we had a few best practices that were complemented by some research and the survey responses. And so the first thing we saw in terms of flexibility is obviously that importance of remote work and flexible hours, and the importance of maximizing the allowable amount of remote work. And so again, to the extent practicable, to the amount possible, making sure that working parents can do as much of a job remotely as is feasible, as we know that they will leave for an opportunity with a better remote work policy. So if you have job functions and responsibilities that can be done remotely, but you're requiring working parents to do them in person, that may show up as a talent retention issue down the road. So just making sure that you have a remote work policy that's really remote work first and enables them to do as much as practicable remotely. And then secondly, again, allowing flexible hours to the extent practicable. We talked about this with the pickup, making sure that if they have responsibilities going to doctor's appointments, picking up children, that they can flex their hours to work earlier, work later in order to accommodate those needs and that scheduling that they can't do outside of working hours usually. In terms of health and well-being, the best practice we saw here was paid parental leave. And again, this is something that was supported in the Opportunity Task Force report. The economic mobility focus from Leading an Opportunity really supported the importance of paid parental leave in order for the benefit of the child and the parent. And so the best practices we saw here were to maximize paid time off based on whatever the company could afford. So giving employees as much time off as a company can afford, and then offering that equally to men and women. And research shows that women's mental health is also improved with paternal leave along with the child outcomes. Again, having that critical window there with the bonding and the development of social capital with the child, it's critical not only to the success of the child, but supporting that mother. So offering that equally to men and women was a critical component. And then having 3 meetings for on and off ramping, making sure that there was sufficient winding down of individuals' responsibilities prior to leaving so that those could be handed off to other team members, but also on-ramping them so that they could get back up to speed and be reintegrated into projects when they return. And when they return, making sure that's a gradual return to work policy to ease individuals in, going from not working at all and being full-time a mother or father to returning to work. Having a more gradual return to work policy to ease them in really supports them to be as successful as possible. And then lastly, looking at dependent leave policies for continual care even after the parental leave period ends. In terms of creating a strong company culture, the best practice we saw to create a culture of support for working parents started with surveying. So exactly what we did here with Goodwill, to have conversations to discover those gaps. So as an employer saying, what could we do better for you as a working parent? Almost as important and critically important here is to have an actionable response to that feedback. So the last thing you want is to survey what can we do better, and then to have that go sit on a shelf and then have everyone feel that they're not being listened to. And so really important is to take an actionable response to that feedback and to show how you're trying to move the needle, how you're trying to make progress given the feedback you've received. And then the other thing here is offering benefits or perks to parents. Again, we talked about 89% of our respondents supported employers offering these benefits and flexibility to parents. So that's a key part of creating a strong culture. And really supporting this work-life integration is critical to make sure that parents can find that balance and that they can do what needs to be done in their personal life with their dependent care responsibilities, as well as be successful in their professional endeavors. And then lastly, just sharing resources that support working parents, community resources, information that they may not have seen that you could just share and send out to your team members that are parents is something that's also critically important. Just again, creating that culture that we're all together and they feel supported is one of those things that goes a long way for talent attraction and retention for working parents. And so that's all I've got for you today on the Working Parents Survey. But I hope you enjoyed this quick update on our survey in partnership with Goodwill.